Okay, this week we're looking at the concept of class. As usual, I'm going to break it up into four different videos. First one on inequality in class, second one on the foundational sociology on class from Marx and Weber. In part three, I'll talk about Pierre Bourdieu's more contemporary ideas of class, and then in the final section, I'll just go over some broader contemporary understandings of what class means today. So let's start with part one, inequality in class. So throughout the course, we've been talking about inequality a fair bit, and as we said in week one, class, gender, race and ethnicity are three very important contours of inequality when it comes to how sociologists understand how the world works. And this week we're going to look at class. The term class is used a little bit in public, a little bit in the media. You don't hear of it that much. It's not a very popular term, and it kind of challenges a lot of the stereotypes about Australia and societies more generally. Australia is kind of based on various myths and legends that it's egalitarian, that it's a country of the fair go, that more recently that the ideas of meritocracy, and really the notion that Australia and broader societies in general are class and have class systems fundamentally challenges some of those myths and stereotypes. It certainly challenges some of the colonial legacies that we kind of largely ignore. And there's even a kind of resistance to talking about it in general that I'll go into a little bit throughout the course as well. But one of the few ways that class is mentioned, ironically I suppose, is whenever there's a call for redistribution of wealth or increasing welfare, or like challenging the right of billionaires to kind of have so much money. It's often kind of framed in this idea of the class war, and then like there's some kind of politics of envy, that the existence of like uber rich people is somehow an example for us all to kind of to aspire to or something. This is often then juxtaposed to kind of undeserving, lazy, poor people. So throughout this lecture, I'm going to kind of provide some of the conceptual tools to think about what's going on in this situation. So I'm going to start talking about inequality and what kind of ways we can think about inequality from a kind of material economic perspective, and then going to talk about class as a sociological way of analysing those inequalities. So we can think about what wealth means, from basic material, economic, financial sense. It refers to total assets owned by an individual minus any debts. Often creates, that wealth often creates income. Wealth kind of creates wealth passively through investments, interests, shares, ownerships of assets and stuff like that. And in Australia, we have a kind of tax system that kind of treats one's wealth, created through those means, much more kind of leniently and easily than kind of wealth and created through labour, through work. So we have a kind of very much economic system that kind of rewards owning stuff. You can see this in kind of tax breaks like negative gearing, where you kind of rewarded for owning a second house, where you can kind of offset any losses you have on the second house through various tax breaks. Wealth is also really difficult to measure. Wealthy people tend to hide it as best they can. And so offshore wealth, like, a few decades ago, was estimated at like $11 trillion, all the kind of global wealth, quarter of the global wealth at the time. We just don't really know how much kind of wealth rich people have, and they're hiding. It's even kind of harder today. Some of this gets released every now and then through kind of leaks or whatever. The Panama Papers in 2016 showed a bunch of examples where people were hiding their wealth. So it's even in terms of the kind of obscene wealth inequality that we have today, it's unlikely that we really know just how much very rich citizens have. Things like global billionaire lists and stuff like that tend to be estimates, and it tends to be kind of paper, kind of theoretical money in a way, based on kind of shares and stuff like that people own that like isn't really liquid. So again, there's all kinds of blurriness what's going on here. But what we do know is that, like, at the moment, in places like Australia, the US and the UK, they're experiencing levels of inequality that we haven't seen since the late 1800s. So we have like extremely polarised wealth inequality at the moment. Another issue about this is the way that wealth and salaries and stuff like that is actually spoken about. Often the the average is used, which is a kind of distortion, really. What we should really probably try and use is the median. And the median is kind of whatever the kind of number is at 50%. The problem with using averages is that the rich people now are so rich that it distorts the average and moves it kind of up to kind of higher rates than it kind of makes the average meaningful, I suppose. So the Grattan Institute put out a cheat sheet every year to kind of help us understand this. And you can see the difference there. There's like 15 grand difference between, the median, what the typical Australian earns at the 50% mark, and the average. This kind of fundamentally distorts stuff. Households in particular there, 92 to 120 grand is a good example of what's a distortion there. I think people are often surprised too when you see something like a taxpayer earning $98,000 or an adult earning $87,000 puts them in the top 20% of earners. I think many people think that earning 90 grand a year probably doesn't make them in the 20% richest people, but frankly it just does. So again, the skewering of our understanding of the level of poverty and the level of kind of average earnings, or median earnings across the scale, is kind of distorted. And many of, for instance, the starting salaries of university graduates are kind of already straight away into the top 20%, even though there's kind of often quite interesting discussions in public how, like, arts degrees or social science or creative industry students go out into the workforce and don't earn a lot of money. Pretty much anyone with a degree that goes out with a starting salary is kind of, it gets a full-time job at least, will be kind of, well and truly in the top 50% at least, and then pretty much moving up to the upper echelons. So again, the figures here are kind of slippery, how you measure things. You can see there's all these different categories: taxpayers, workers, adults, households. Households are adjusted for size. And when various aspects of the economy, when there are various aspects of wealth, finances or whatever are spoken about in the media and in politics, it's hard to sometimes keep track of what's going on here. In terms of the incredible inequality going on at the moment, I think in the book called The Broken Ladder, which is a social psychologist in the US talking about the different psychological aspects of what develops in unequal societies, there's this kind of nifty comparison here about how to measure, the huge uber wealth. Earning up to 200 grand just gets you up to the guy's shins, but actually to represent this kind of stuff in a normal graph, you would have to extend the kind of upper echelon to the kind of 6 foot tall. It doesn't really fit on a page. This kind of ultra wealthy, it's hard to actually represent in figures. Not only we don't know often how rich these people are, but it's very hard to kind of represent in comparison. There's a link there if you want to kind of check some of that stuff out, to kind of learn about some of how that can be done. So, the notion of class, therefore, is a kind of way of sociologically understanding how these kind of huge levels of inequality work. So what class analysis does essentially recognizes that we live in particular societies that are organized in particular ways, and therefore some people are more advantaged than others. And further than that, the way that kind of various systems and institutions are set up tend to prioritize and reward and essentially run by those that are more advantaged. And I'll talk about the various class aspects of that in a second in terms of what who's labelled and what those labels are. We live in a capitalist society, essentially, where wealth and profit is prioritised. And we've kind of got this ideology, I suppose, where having lots of money, the kind of the quest for wealth, the quest for more stuff, has been associated with being happy and satisfied. Now, again, the sociological research in that shows that that's not really the case. Levels of happiness tend to change a little bit. They tend to kind of get better up to a certain amount of money that kind of basically covers everyday needs and wants. But after that, levels of happiness and stuff like that don't really track on to how much money people have. In fact, anecdotally, if you look around and look at kind of the rich billionaires or whatever in the world at the moment that kind of dominate our media as well, they don't look particularly happy, do they? And they don't look particularly satisfied. So here the kind of correlation between wealth and happiness is fundamentally challenged from a class understanding. But that's what we also know there is that many kind of aspects of social suffering are disproportionately apportioned to those with less money and in poverty and that are disadvantaged. And I'll go through examples of that as well. So particularly thinking about class at a global level too as a kind of more contemporary way of thinking about it. So within Australia, for instance, we already have those that own the means of production and those that don't, those that are kind of professional middle class that get good salaries but don't own things. Again, I'll go into that more in a minute. But we also need to think about class on this kind of global level. The global north in particular, what we're calling the minority world in the book, tend to kind of have an exploitative relation with the majority world. All our kind of gadgets and, you know, the metals and all this kind of stuff are mined and shipped out of those countries. So there's a kind of class relationship that happens at this broader global level as well. So we need to think about that through that class lens when we think about those relations as well. But I will say for the rest of the lecture, for the most part, what I'm talking about is class systems within countries, with a focus mostly on Australia. So if you want to kind of check out, though, how rich you are or how poor you are on a kind of global level, there's a link there to a little kind of calculator that does that. One of the really important things that class analysis challenges is the idea of meritocracy. The idea that if you work hard enough and if you're talented enough, you'll kind of rise to the top. Now, a version of meritocracy kind of works, but the problem with it is not everyone starts from the same point. And for those from more disadvantaged backgrounds, with kind of less cultural capital, that I'll talk about more at the end of the lecture, they are disadvantaged in terms of kind of a trajectory. Most class analysis shows that people at the various levels of class, you know, regardless of how you set it up and how you measure it, tend to kind of end up at the end of the life in the same class that they started at. There's upward mobility and there's downward mobility, but for the most part, people, you know, stay in their class. What complicates this is kind of generational differences. In many ways, you know, the children of the boomers kind of have more stuff in many ways, you know, like iPhones and gadgets, and it's kind of appear more wealthy in terms of ownership of stuff in some ways. But really, when it comes to things like cost of living, being able to afford housing, being able to afford to kind of set up your kids and all that kind of stuff, current generations have much less of that. And this, again, relates to that kind of generational inequality. So, what a really amazing analysis of this is Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett's work from about 15, 20 years ago, but they've constantly updated this research on what they call the spirit level. And what they found was that unequal societies basically have worse social indicators than more equal societies. Now, this kind of comparison can be done between countries. Countries with less inequality have better outcomes than those that have more more unequal societies. But also happens within countries. They showed even in like American states, like in counties down to that level, counties like next to each other in the same state, the ones with more inequality had much worse indicators. And by indicators here, I mean health levels, how long people live, how many people are committing crimes or in jail, all kinds of those kind of social indicators. So again, I think a really good thing to do now would be to stop and watch the TED Talk that Richard Wilkinson did, I think about 10 years ago now, talking about this book. It's a really influential book, and it shows how the demography of inequality and the health outcomes and the kind of satisfaction outcomes are much better in more equal societies than they are in unequal societies. So please have a look at that now. Okay, so what I've kind of done here is sketch out a broader understanding of inequality. I'm going to move now and into the next parts of the lecture to think about class itself. And as I said, class is not a term that's used a lot in public discourse, but it is used kind of colloquially. You know, classy is seen as something that's been good and prosperous. High class is something that's kind of snobby, pretentious. I mentioned kind of class war and resentment and stuff like that. But class is also kind of represented and used through language, through terms, things like bogan and westie in the UK, chav, the kind of global hipster, the kind of middle class consumer, things like tossy and yuppie and snob. All these are kind of class terms. They're kind of pointing towards class without really talking about class. So in terms of the sociological understanding of class, there's a number of different theories that have been developed over the last kind of century or so. And what they all do is kind of point out kind of systematic relations in terms of how inequality works. They focus on different aspects of society. And as someone myself who's interested in class as a researcher, I don't really kind of favour one more than others. I've been particularly influenced by Pierre Bourdieu in my own work, and I'll talk about that in the third part of the lecture. The classical theories, Marx and Weber, kind of set up a kind of economic analysis and then a more cultural analysis, and Bourdieu brings those together. But there's lots of different ways of thinking about class, and they all have their kind of strengths and weaknesses, but they tend to shine lights on different aspects of how inequality works. They all tend to emphasise the cultural, the symbolic, or the economic in one way or another. And what's increasingly important today is that class and studying class is not just about studying disadvantage, it's also understanding advantage and privilege, and that's, you know, particularly the case more recently as kind of billionaires have started to dominate, you know, just about everything. Okay, I'll end that part there, and then I'll move on to talk about Marx and Weber, who are the key kind of foundational theorists about class in sociology.